Hi everybody, let's break down Artur Beterbiev versus Callum Smith. No surprises here. Beterbiev has a 100% KO ratio. He's 20 knockouts in 20 fights and 20 wins. Callum Smith moved up 3 fights ago and has moved up to light heavyweight and has fought Beterbiev in his 3rd fight at light heavyweight. So let's take a look first at Callum Smith and what kind of went wrong for him. Now, it's going to sound like I'm really picking on Callum Smith, but I'm doing so in order to kind of, I think we can learn about some boxing basic techniques by breaking down what didn't go well for Callum Smith. And then after all of that, I'm going to kind of let him off the hook. And then I'll move on to just 1 or 2 points about Beterbiev. All right, so Callum Smith, the first thing I noticed with him was that he just did not get going with the jab early on in the fight and didn't use it with as much frequency and as much speed as he could have or needed to. Now, it's interesting to note that between rounds, I think towards the middle rounds, his trainer, Buddy McGirt, did call for him to pick it up with the jab. And it's not, as I say, rocket science, right? When you're the taller fighter with the height advantage and the reach advantage, use the heck out of your jab just to keep the other guy off you. And then you can then set up the rest of your combinations, see where there's openings, figure out your opponent's timing with your jab, and then you pick it up and add on to your jab. But of course, with all fighters, everything starts with the jab. But for that taller person with the longer reach, it's kind of a no-brainer. That should be your bread and butter from the get-go. And for whatever reason, Callum Smith was throwing single jabs, and he was throwing slow single jabs from the outset. So I'm not sure what the cause of that is. There's a couple things I can think of. One, he didn't warm up enough in the back, which doesn't make sense because Buddy McGirt is an outstanding world-class trainer, and he's a world championship level fighter himself. So he knows darn well how crucial it is to get that warm up in the back change room and get your fighter with sweat going and just get him going, adrenaline wise and mentally as well as physically, so he's ready to just get going with the fight. So I don't know that lack of warm up is the reason. The other reason, a second reason, could be that simply Callum Smith didn't subject himself to enough tough sparring to prepare himself for Beterbiev's, speed and power right from the outset. And also Beterbiev's lack of being intimidated by someone who's that much taller and that much lankier than him. So if Callum Smith did put himself through some tough sparring, then I would hope that he would have been able to kind of gauge how to get going with his jab right from the outset, from round 1. Again, I don't know what went on in his camp, and certainly Buddy McGirt would be somebody who would know what type of sparring his fighter needs. Now, did the fighter sort of override him? Did the other people in the camp override Buddy, or did that just not happen? Only they know what went on behind closed doors in their sparring sessions. So that's another possibility. And then the third possibility is just it's a mental aspect with Callum, where he just didn't get going with his jab. I don't know if that's being intimidated when he realized that Beterbiev brought more to the table than he anticipated, or Beterbiev, like physically, or Beterbiev brought more to the table, mentally, and didn't perhaps cower away from as some of his other opponents might have. So these are questions only Callum Smith and his corner can answer. But let's take a closer look at the jab again. So another thing I noticed with Callum, the jab is tied very much to the fighter's stance. And for whatever reason, Callum has this stance where he kind of leans forward a bit, which to me doesn't really make that much sense, especially because if you look at Beterbiev's stance, he's a fighter who's got this completely upright torso and then just, he just covers up with high guard. But Beterbiev has the better stance than Callum, even though he's the shorter person. I don't know why Callum does that and leans forward with his waist, because that gives away his, as they say, his reach advantage. It brings his head closer as a target to his opponent. So I don't know if that's just a habit that has been built in over time and is hard for him to break, but I think that certainly didn't help him leaning forward. So let's take a look at the rest of his stance. Okay, so that's the top half of his body is leaning forward. But let's take a look at the bottom half of his body and his foot position. And this is really crucial. Take a look at Callum Smith's feet. He has a very, as we call it, bladed stance, which means he's turned very much sideways to his opponent, which is a smart thing to do, especially if you're the lankier guy, because then your opponent doesn't have any target area, right? They're just looking at the straight line of your torso. They're not looking at you square. So you've removed the target area by taking that bladed stance. Now, here's the issue with Callum's feet. He's adopted what I call a fencer's stance. That means his lead foot, which is his left foot, because he's an orthodox fighter, his left foot is pointed straight forward at 12 o'clock. Here's the crucial part. His right foot, which is his support foot in the back, is pointed at 3 o'clock. That means his left foot and his right foot are perpendicular to each other. That's fine for fencers because they're going to push off that right foot to go straight forward, and then they're going to be able to push with their left foot to go straight backwards, back onto their right foot. So that stance is okay if you're only going to ever move straight forward, back and forth, which is what fencers do. But, and this is crucial, I mean, boxers need to move at angles, not just straight forward and straight back. So that stance, you can still adopt that stance and move to your, say, 10 o'clock, right? You can try this yourself. Just stand up and do it. You can push off your right foot when it's perpendicular to your left foot and still move your left foot off to 10 o'clock, let's say. But try that stance and try to cut to 1 or 2 o'clock off to your right. You kind of sort of can't, right? Now, from that same stance, try to move laterally, meaning directly to 3 o'clock or 6 o'clock. It's much more challenging. So, stance, that's why a true boxer stance is not 12 and 3. Instead, it's you point your left foot at a bit of an angle, so it's kind of at between 12 and 1 o'clock, and then your left foot is parallel to your right foot, but straight behind, also pointing off in the 12:30, 1 o'clock direction. So this way, you can move straight forward, straight back, but you can also move to the angles in one step, and you don't have to reposition your feet in order to take that step off to the angle, or even just sideways, laterally. Okay, so Callum Smith's bladed stance with the fencer foot position limited his mobility. And that's a little bit ironic given, again, that he's the taller, lankier guy. Finally, let's look at a few tactics, which were also, leave me with some questions. So, in terms of his ring movement, Callum tend to allow Beterbiev to move him backwards into the ropes, which is exactly where you don't want to be against particularly a well-known power puncher. You don't want to be on the ropes, and I would think that a trainer on the level of Buddy McGirt would have told Callum in sparring or in the gym, hey, under pain of death shall you feel the ropes on your back. Do not let your back touch the ropes. Because he wants to train his fighter during the sparring sessions not to do that, not to back up straight to the ropes and then get stuck on there. Now, if you look at Callum's fight versus Canelo, he did do that, but he was always able to circle out to, counterclockwise, kind of to the left and get off the ropes. So the question there is, of course, well, perhaps Canelo was just allowing him to do so, and in a sense, I think that's accurate, because Canelo just loves to fight, I believe, and he I guess he just didn't want to finish, maybe just figured he didn't want to finish Callum on the ropes with a barrage of punches, so, let's just keep going here. Eventually I'm going to get to you, or I'm eating up these rounds to practice, so to speak. I think Canelo has had the luxury of knowing he kind of had the W in the bag, so he didn't necessarily feel the urgency to stop Callum. But, Callum in his corner could have looked at that fight and said, hey, did we really need to put ourselves on the ropes like that? All right, so that's one, I feel, sort of ring generalmanship error. The other kind of technical issue was Callum did display good head movement, and he was able to slip punches even when he did back himself up to the rope. But the old cliche, make him miss, make him pay. He didn't do the second half of that, so he made Beterbiev miss, but he did not make him pay. And why is that? Well, a lot of that has to do with positioning, right? If you're just going to be covered up, or you're just going to slip, but your feet are parallel and you're leaning back on the ropes, you're not really in a great position to counter. Being able to counter off the ropes and putting yourself on the ropes in a sort of offensive mindset, thinking, hey, I'm going to counter you when you come to me. That is some very high level, black belt, competitive, world-class technique. It's not for just, I wouldn't, hey, a regular black belt, a regular competitor, you should never do that, ever, right? Not everybody can be Ali or James Toney. So, kudos to Callum Smith for having great head movement, but as my trainer would yell at me, for sure, if I just slipped or rolled and didn't come back with a punch, I would get yelled at immediately right then and there in live time. So the training during the sparring session is, come right back with a punch, or come with a punch on the weave under. But do not just make these defensive movements. Okay, so there's my laundry list for Callum Smith, right? Not enough double, triple, quadruple jabs even. Leaning forward, foot position, putting himself on the ropes, and then not firing back off his defensive moves. So now I'm going to let him off the hook. My huge question for Callum Smith is, does he want to stay at light heavyweight? And the reason I ask that is he had, most of his success as at super middle, right? He got built up to become a world champion, and then, as promoters are wont to do, and I think this is what happened. Eddie Hearn cashed out on him. Hey, I made you a world champion. We're gonna cash out on you. Now, look at this. You're gonna get to fight Canelo. So he fights Canelo. Callum Smith fights Canelo and loses that 12-round decision. And then, for whatever reason, again, it's personal. He and his camp know. He decides to move up to light heavyweight. All right. And then fights two light heavyweights that I think are relatively unknown. No offense to them. And then in his third fight at light heavyweight decides, okay, he's got to take on Beterbiev to unify the belts. All right, so let's dial it back. Everything I mentioned about his technique and his tactics, I believe he was able to, quote-unquote, get away with as a super middle. Because at that weight division, he just had that much more of a size advantage that these habits didn't cost him as much, if at all. Because if you look at his fights at super middle, he was definitely able to generate a fair amount of torque simply from his build. And he did have that one punch KO ability at super middle. So my question is, you take one L in your career as a super middleweight, and it's to arguably a legend in the sport in Canelo. Why did you then decide to move up to light heavy? Like, he said something about after that Artur Beterbiev that he's disappointed that he, quote unquote, couldn't be the best in the world. So I'm wondering if that same mindset is what had him move out of the super middle. He just said, oh, I can't be number one at super middle because Canelo Alvarez exists at the same time that I do. I had the misfortune of being born in this era where somebody as special as Canelo Alvarez exists, so I'm going to move up. I don't know if that's the mindset, but I don't know that that's the right reason to move up to light middle. And now that Artur Beterbiev just showed us, I don't know if Callum Smith can, quote unquote, hang at light heavy with all the other world-class light heavyweights. So, does Callum want to move back down? Or he has a couple choices there. I think if he moves back down, he knows he can still do what he did for, all his fights previously. If he's going to stay at light heavy, in my opinion, he needs to address every single one of those points I just raised, because they are boxing fundamentals that Callum was able to get away with at super middle against everybody except for Canelo, right? Well, there's no shame in losing to Canelo, but if he's not willing to address, certainly his footwork, his stance, and just those ring tactics, I say go back down. Here's why. At this stage of the game, unless you're super, super dedicated and super coachable, it's going to be really, really tough for him to change his foot positioning and stance and whatnot. It's going to just take a ton of drilling and a ton of messing up. And it's going to be super tedious and probably frustrating for him to have to do that. But in my opinion, that's sort of what he needs to do if he wants to stay up at light heavy. Okay, so only Callum Smith and his team know, what's reasonable for him, if he can still make super middleweight, or if he wants to really rethink himself at light heavyweight. Well, let's move on to Beterbiev. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time breaking that down, because I'm sure there's a lot of other people commentating on how great Beterbiev is. And Certainly, we could point to a number of things he did well, but I'm going to point to one thing that for sure he does superbly outside the ring, and it's a rarity in my opinion. And that is Artur Beterbiev's weight training or strength training regimen. Now he has, in my opinion, he has an absolutely legit strength coach. I think the fellow's name is Andrei Kuleska, or I'm sorry if I mispronounced his strength coach's name. But this gentleman has a PhD from a university in Poland. And I can tell just from a little bit of the footage I've watched of them working together that he knows his stuff. He's a legit strength coach. He could work with any athlete in any sport because strength, contrary to what you've heard, is not quote unquote sport specific. Strength is strength. You build a stronger athlete, you have to do some, as we call hypertrophy, right? You have to build the muscle because every single one of us, if we look at ourselves, if we examine ourselves honestly, we have a weakness, say, for example, in what we call the posterior chain. It's a chain of muscles. And as they say, you're only strong as your weakest link. So whatever that is for you, in my case, I believe it was my glutes. So I mean, it doesn't matter how strong the rest of my posterior chain is. If my glutes are my weakest point, then I got to address those because things fall apart at the weakest point. So my point behind that is that's why it doesn't need to be quote unquote sport specific, because if a strength coach a strength coach should understand human anatomy and physiology and be able to know how to test any athlete to identify where their strong points and their weak points are and then address both accordingly. So it's clear that Beterbiev has a legit strength coach because there's more than one little clip of him doing what we call external rotations, which is basically you stand with your arms straight out, say, to your side, and then you would bend at the elbow. So now your forearm is 90 degrees to your bicep. And then you bring your fist up towards the ceiling and you just go back and forth like that. Well, it's not a very impressive exercise because you're not going to use a lot of weight with that. It's not very, as we say, Instagrammable. It's not as impressive as dropping 350 pounds on your chest and bouncing it off like Deontay Wilder, right? But it's way more effective than that garbage bench press that Deontay Wilder did. Anyone who's ever had shoulder issues knows that you need to work the external rotation and the internal, of course, too. But my point being here is that is what we would call an accessory exercise. It's not a show-off exercise, but it's an important exercise for injury prevention and to address any, as I said, weak areas in the shoulder. So the fact that Beterbiev has posts up there of him doing that indicates to me that he has a legit strength coach. And of course, if you look at the rest of the footage of him working with this strength coach, it looks solid. And he's been working with this strength coach, I think, since he moved to Canada, as far as I know. So that's another sort of telling aspect for me about Beterbiev, is he moved from Dagestan, which is the same place Khabib Nurmagomedov made famous, right? Dagestan. Artur chose to move from Dagestan to, of all places, Montreal in order to further his boxing career. Now that's an interesting choice because if you're going to move across the ocean, you might think, well, why didn't you move to LA, boxing hotbed, or even, some other place in Southern California, because the weather's completely conducive to what a boxer's daily routine is. It's wonderful to wake up and just be able to go out in your t-shirt and shorts and do your road work at, say, 5:30 or 6, and then have the sun come up, and then it's not too humid, it's not too cold for sure, and the temperature's perfect. As long as you get out there and do your road work in Southern California, before the sun comes up, it's not too hot and you're not dying. As soon as the sun starts to come up, by 8:30, it's just way too hot. But you can hit that sweet spot in the morning. It's perfect. So then you go home, shower up, breakfast, rest a little bit, and then head off to the gym, maybe somewhere between 10:30 and 12, I'm guessing, to get your main boxing session in. And then evening, go do your strength and conditioning or whatever else if you want to do a third workout for the day. But let's contrast that to Montreal. Okay, wake up in the morning, 5:30. You want to know how cold it is out there right now? It is below zero in Montreal for a good part of the winter months. Now, I grew up in a city just a couple hours from Montreal. I grew up in Ottawa. Montreal, let's talk geography a little bit. So where's Montreal located? Well, okay, imagine North America. Now, you know that the gateway into North America from the Atlantic Ocean is that river called the St. Lawrence. Come into North America via the St. Lawrence River, and eventually you'll hit all the Great Lakes. So now, geographically, as you're coming down the St. Lawrence, before you get to the Great Lakes, you're going to hit this island right in the middle of the St. Lawrence. And that island is Montreal. All right, now, there's a river a tributary to the St. Lawrence that hits the St. Lawrence right where Montreal is located. And it runs north by northeast. And that is the Ottawa River. So if you go up that river for an hour and a half, 2 hours, you'll hit Ottawa. That's where I grew up. So I'm pretty familiar with Montreal. And I can attest to you for sure, winters in that part of Ontario and Quebec are, I wouldn't say they're brutal, but they're pretty cold. You're going to get snow from late October till March. And temperatures can be like minus 20. Let's put it this way. On some of the coldest days, if I would spit, I could hear the spit crackle as it froze. So that gives you a bit of a visual. On the other hand, I actually enjoyed growing up in Ottawa with the snow, because once it snows, the snow is solid on the ground, not like packed, but it could be, you can go skiing. So once it snows, the snow's there on the ground, it stops snowing, the sun comes out, the sun reflects off the snow, so it's actually warm. And so if you go Nordic skiing or downhill skiing, you get that sun bounced off the snow and you warm up. Here's another fun fact for you. When it's snowing, that's an exothermic reaction. So by the water freezing into snow, energy is released into the atmosphere. So it's actually warmer when it snows. All right. Science lesson aside, my point there being it is cold from late fall to spring. And with Montreal being that island right in the middle of the St. Lawrence, it's even colder because they get the lovely wind chill factor because they're in the middle of a river. So my point being, Artur Beterbiev chose to move somewhere where it's going to be quite something if he decides to go out and do road work. Now, maybe he does all his road work running on a treadmill. I don't know. But even then, you got to get up and go outside early in the morning. I mean, sometimes it'd be so cold in Ottawa that the car engine would freeze. Certainly you need anti-lock, right? Because back when we had actual physical keys, that lock would freeze up. Your gas line can freeze. Sometimes you're just couldn't get the engine to get going in the morning. And of course, can't get the engine on. You got no heat in your car. You're just sitting there freezing. I can remember mornings like that when I'm trying to get to swim practice, and my poor father had to try to like get this car going so we could get there for 6:30 in the morning. So it's interesting to me that Artur chose to move to somewhere that's incredibly cold, rather than somewhere else in North America that's a little bit warmer. Now, only he and his team again know why he chose Montreal. It could be that he had a business connection there with Group Yvon Michel initially, or maybe he met his coaches and just really wanted to work with that specific coach in Montreal. I'm not sure, but my point being, you got to have a certain mindset to be willing to deal with the Montreal winter. It's not for the faint of heart. And finally, just to contrast Beterbiev with Callum Smith in terms of being a light heavyweight, don't forget, Beterbiev has been fighting at lightweight since his amateur days. In fact, he lost to Usyk twice in the amateurs, so he's well seasoned as a light heavyweight. Whereas Callum Smith is only a couple fights in, so technically Callum Smith is a sub-novice, meaning he only has 3 fights, so he's a sub-novice at light heavyweight. So, that's how I'm letting Callum off the hook, just saying, does he really want to be at this division? And in a sense, he didn't really have a fair shot against someone who's beyond a seasoned veteran at light heavy. So that's my analysis. Again, I was very critical of Callum Smith, but more so I could illustrate some key points about boxing. And what do you think? Do you think Callum Smith should stay light heavy? Do you think he should go back down to super middle? I think there's no question about what people want to see next for Beterbiev. Everybody's now anticipating Beterbiev-Bivol. How do you think those fights go? What do you think Callum Smith should do? Please let me know in the comments below, and thank you so much for listening.